The Summer Games Minute, brought to you by Mass Mutual. For most professional athletes, versatility means they can play a few different positions in a single sport. For Babe Dietrichson-Zaharias, versatility means dominance across the entire spectrum of sport. In the 1932 Summer Games in Los Angeles, Zaharias won gold in the 80-meter hurdles and the javelin throw, plus she got a silver in the high jump. Running, throwing, jumping wasn't enough for Babe, so she became a competitive billiards player, then jumped into professional golf, winning 10 major championships, all the while making a few pitching appearances in Major League Baseball spring training games. Mass Mutual understands the nuances in how women want and need to manage their finances. With quality product solutions and guidance, a Mass Mutual financial professional can help you plan for both short-term and long-term money goals. Learn more and get started at massmutual.com.
As you've probably heard by now, we've teamed up with BetMGM this season. We'll be using BetMGM lines to make all of our picks, and we'll have special offers for our listeners each week. If you haven't signed up for BetMGM yet, use bonus code The Athletic, and you'll get a 1-year subscription to The Athletic, plus up to a $1,500 first bet offer on your first wager with BetMGM. Here's how it works. Download the BetMGM app and sign up using bonus code The Athletic. Make your first deposit of at least $10. Place your first bet on any game and claim your voucher for a 1-year subscription to The Athletic. See BetMGM.com for terms. U.S. promotional offers not available in D.C., Mississippi, New York, Nevada, Ontario, or Puerto Rico. Gambling problem? Call 1-800-GAMBLER. Available in the U.S. Call 877-8-HOPE-NY or text HOPE-NY 467-369 in New York. Call 1-800-NEXT-STEP in Arizona. 1-800-327-5050 in Massachusetts. 1-800-BETS-OFF in Iowa. 1-800-270-7117 for confidential help in Michigan. 1-800-981-0023 in Puerto Rico. First bet offer for new customers only in partnership with Kansas Crossing Casino and Hotel. Don't forget, if you haven't signed up for BetMGM yet, use bonus code The Athletic, and you'll get a 1-year subscription to The Athletic, plus up to a $1,500 first bet offer on your first wager.
Ryan Reynolds here from Mint Mobile. With the price of just about everything going up during inflation, we thought we'd bring our prices down. So to help us, we brought in a reverse auctioneer, which is apparently a thing.
Mint Mobile Unlimited Premium Wireless. How to get 30, 30, bit to get 30, bit to get 20, 20, 20, bit to get 20, 20, bit to get 15, 15, 15, 15, just $15 a month? Sold!
Give it a try at mintmobile.com/switch.
$45 up front for 3 months plus taxes and fees. Promo rate for new customers for limited time. Unlimited more than 40 gigabytes per month. Slows full terms at mintmobile.com.
The Athletic.
The race is on, and George Russell's return to the front in F1 has led to questions about his racecraft in precious situations, while Red Bull's driver decisions continue to baffle. I'm Edd Straw, and joining me to tackle your questions on those topics and many more are Scott Mitchell-Malm and Ben Anderson. Well, Ben, welcome back. Another questions episode, and we're very excited this week, aren't we? Because the Race Members Club's now on Patreon. How excited are you about that?
Yeah, it's a really good development for us. Just a cleaner, better way for us to serve our members, give them more, give them a better experience. And just tap into something that's obviously been around for a while, but we haven't been utilising. So, exciting times for the race. Yeah,
absolutely. And you can continue to subscribe to the Race Members Club the way you've always done if you like. But yes, the Patreon is now launched as well, and there's various extra things in there. There's a MotoGP tier among it. And we're just quite pleased about managing just to inch up the Race Members Club a little bit more. All the normal stuff that's been available for non-members will stay the same, and members will get everything that they get currently, and hopefully a little bit more. And I can tell you're excited, Scott.
I am. We how often do we talk about marginal gains on this podcast? And that is what we're pursuing with the Patreon approach. It's just about, it's a refinement of the existing kind of experience and offering, isn't it? And I've used Patreon for all sorts at different times, and that kind of flexibility of like what suits you, and the main thing for me is that it's really easy to use, and I know from some of the things we've discussed about what feedback we've had from members, and that support from members is massive. It always blows me away when I hear how many people have done it. When we did the live show, do you remember? I know it's not quite the same, but when we did the live show of this podcast, and there's so many people turned up to support us. Like, that stuff is really humbling and it's a very affirming experience. And you don't want to take advantage of that and then shortchange people that are then trying to support you. And this is a way of avoiding that and making sure that people get their money's worth, which, where we're concerned, we have to work extra hard for, because sometimes we're idiots.
Absolutely. If you're interested in finding out a little bit more about the Patreon membership, you can go to patreon.com/the race. There's no hyphen in the race in that one, so it's patreon.com/the race. There's more information there.
So forget the hyphen.
Exactly, you forget the hyphen on this case. Yeah, there's 3 tiers: riders, racers, and champions. Riders is the bikes only version, and hopefully that will appeal to people. But like I say, it doesn't affect existing members. You can jump across to the Patreon version if you're so inclined, or you can carry on as you are. It's all about offering the range of choice. But yeah, hopefully that's another step in the Race Members Club. Let's get on with some questions, because as I always say, we got countless questions after the Canadian Grand Prix, and we always have plenty left over. So we've got another of our questions podcast. Scott, first up, a question for you from Altar. Do you think George Russell has a tendency to fumble under high pressure, particularly in crucial moments with consequences, or was this just an unluckily timed error? That's, of course, about Canada. And Simon Ems asked about the mistakes Russell made in Canada as well, and if it's unfair to think there might be a lack of sharpness in his racecraft.
It's tricky, because it's not a universal thing. It's not that every single time Russell ends up in a position under pressure, or in a position where there's a big result on the table, he fumbles it and blows it. If that was the case, he wouldn't have won the 2022 Brazilian Grand Prix. And I would say there are, even if it's your teammate, I would say there are very few scenarios in F1 that are more high-pressured than having a hungry Lewis Hamilton desperate for a win right under your gearbox, basically, for however many laps Russell had to put up with that pressure for. So I don't think it's that straightforward. What I would say is that as the Mercedes era of not having the regular opportunities has continued, there have perhaps been a few too many moments of him overreaching in pursuit of an opportunity that he doesn't know if he'll get again. You actually see it in a couple of different ways. Do you remember Canada last year I think it was last year in qualifying. It was 22 or 23, where it was rain hit in qualifying, and there was a choice of whether you finished it in on inters, or you could have gambled on slicks, but it wouldn't have worked. And I think Russell was one of the ones who gambled on slicks, because he was like, I want to go for pole. I don't care if I qualify X or Y. It's pole or bust. And it backfired, and then he had a worse race and a worse result as a consequence of that. Different example, but it just shows that kind of mindset of like, we're not often in contention for this kind of thing, so I want to go all out for that. And then sometimes you see in races, kind of the last year where he made the mistake, I don't think it's a lack of concentration necessarily, but then you have Singapore.
It's living on the edge, isn't it? It's like it's the same thing that Max went through. When the car's not quite there, but you should be up there, you just take a few more risks than maybe you should sometimes. And like Max kind of sees that now, and maybe Russell's kind of living through that moment live, if you like.
Yeah, I think sometimes he doesn't leave himself enough margin, both physically on track, as evidenced by the Singapore error last year, but also maybe mentally as well. One of the things that we have talked about before, and that drivers and team people talk about a lot, is that kind of that capacity that drivers have. The best drivers are operating at their best with mental capacity in reserve. So they're not always at the limit, because if you don't have any margin, that is where errors creep in. There are too many errors now. Like the number of mistakes that there have been is too high for a driver that wants to be a world champion and regularly win races. But Ben made the point about Verstappen. I've made it about Russell before as well. The best drivers do go through this at some point, especially when they get those opportunities for the first time. And I think Russell, I may have said this over the winter, is in that kind of Verstappen 2018 territory where he needs to progress now. He needs to show that not only is he super fast but occasionally error prone. He needs to show that he can deliver on that, and that won't happen in an instant. It didn't for Verstappen. It was over 18, 19, 20 is when he really evolved into this super consistent, super dependent performer. And Russell's got the speed. He showed that with that pole position in Montreal, and he also showed once he'd made the mistake behind Verstappen that that lost him track position and dropped him back behind Hamilton, the way he then got back past his teammate, like he was so determined to make up for the error, he raced Hamilton hard and fairly and nailed him. Basically, Hamilton played that well too. But that was a little glimpse of that's what Russell is capable of in wheel-to-wheel moments. So it definitely needs refinement and he needs to improve. But there's enough evidence still to suggest that it's not just every time this happens, he chokes.
Yeah, I don't think it's necessarily a pressure thing, as the question suggested. I think there's just sometimes imprecision in battle that comes from overreaching a little bit, and like things like Singapore a couple of years ago. Remember when he just hit Mick Schumacher needlessly, and kind of he got away with that because quite often drivers down the back, when they have incidents with front runners, just automatically get the blame. But that was just Russell being imprecise. He'd already been off in that race as well. So it's all those things. Crashing in Canada last year, had that off after his pit stop
Vegas
at Monaco
last year with Max.
Yeah, exactly.
He was quite clumsy there as well, wasn't he? It's just a little bit sort of silly, needless collision.
Yeah, it's those moments of imprecision that he needs to cut out. And he needs to crack on with it because he's in his, sixth season now, isn't he? So this is equivalent of 2020 for Verstappen, albeit he spent those 3 years in fairly unpromising situation down towards the back most of the time at Williams. So slightly different, but yeah, that's the key question for me with Russell. And a related question for you, Ben, from John O'Hara, who says, has there ever been a more Jekyll and Hyde performance than George Russell trying to overtake other drivers versus George Russell trying to overtake Hamilton? He repeatedly got himself in trouble with half-hearted overtakes and defensive moves in Canada, and then absolutely monstered Hamilton.
Yeah, I think in Hamilton's defence there was a tyre offset, which didn't help the situation. Russell was coming at him on grippier, medium tyres and Hamilton was on hards. And sometimes when you're racing your teammate, yes, there's more risk of fallout if it goes wrong and you clatter each other, as we've seen with the Alpine drivers recently. But sometimes racing your teammate, if you're the aggressor, can be to your benefit because you can sometimes bank on the other guy not defending as hard as they might do if it was someone else. So I'd imagine Hamilton partly calculated, well, I'm on the slower tyre, my teammate's barrelling past me, I've got to give him some space. But it was, to be fair to Russell, a ballsy move, on the limit of grip. He almost lost control of the rear going in on that wet patch. So again, like Scott said, he's capable of it, but it's not like he nails these moves every time. It's a bit of a yo-yoing situation. Some drivers, we saw this with Michael Schumacher, didn't we? They're better at qualifying at the front and seeing races out from the front. I don't think the Mercedes was the quickest car in dry conditions, or even in, it's probably the quickest car in the dry conditions and not in the intermediate conditions at the start of that race. So it didn't really play to the strengths of the car in terms of how it played out, and also to maybe Russell. But in terms of the move, I think it was a good move. But I don't know if he would have been quite the same if he'd been racing someone not also in a Mercedes.
Ed, you said that Russell needs to crack on with kind of resolving this, and I do agree. As you said, he's now in that kind of 2020 version of Verstappen. As I was saying last year, I felt that could have been his 18 season. So there does need to be that progression now. But do you think that timeline has been condensed by what's happening within Mercedes driver-wise? Because he's not got another year alongside Hamilton after this, where he can, where he gets given that kind of what would it be in the end? As kind of that would have been like a 4-year process of changing of the guard and becoming the number one. He's got to lead this team next season, but he's got to lead that team up most likely alongside a young driver in Kimi Antonelli, who is being talked of as the future of Mercedes, not just by us and by pundits, but by Toto Wolff, and while he still says, Russell's the future of this team as well, he kind of says both of them. Like Antonelli's the next big thing. So does Russell kind of need to make a really emphatic claim for that, absolute elite level driver status before Kimi gets in and gets his feet under the table?
Oh yeah, you've got to be at your absolute best, haven't you? Once Hamilton's gone, you can't be the co-leader or the apprentice or anything anymore. And if you're not, then they'll look elsewhere, which connects actually quite nicely to the next question, which I'll throw in now. And partially in answering what you just said, Scott, but Jeremy Husted says, time to bring out your driver market crystal ball. Assuming Kimi Antonelli signs with Mercedes in 25 and performs well, what happens if Verstappen decides he wants Mercedes in 2026? Could you see a situation where Russell and Verstappen coexist? And if not, would he look to return to Williams or go somewhere else? I think in that scenario, well, there's several things. Firstly, it will turn into, if Russell is at his best and Antonelli thrives, Mercedes might think, actually, we don't need Verstappen anymore. That's one of their...
they're going to go for him, though, aren't they? Surely they're going to go for him.
Yeah, I think more likely...
Toto's obsessed.
I think more likely they will get him. And if it comes down to, right, we've got Verstappen for 26, then it's Verstappen, and then you put him alongside whichever of those two is doing better.
Yeah.
I think it's as simple as that. Obviously, there has to be an allowance for judging them in 25 based on the experience. Russell will be in his 7th season. Antonelli
I think it'd be biased to Antonelli, wouldn't it? Because of how much they feel about him and the potential element.
Exactly. That means that Antonelli would be spared more mistakes and off weekends and that kind of thing. It's more about his trajectory. So that very much comes back to the question of Russell needing to be the finished article, because if he's performing as well as Russell can, but he cuts back on those mistakes and maybe takes a little bit of a step, there's just still a few subtleties of tyre management I think he struggles with. Sometimes goes a bit too hard early in stints.
Yes.
I think he did that on the Inters as well in Canada. If he can smooth those two things out, then it becomes very difficult, because you start thinking, well, if Russell's the finished article and we think Antonelli's brilliant, then that's why they might think, actually, we don't need Verstappen, because Verstappen will be enormously expensive to extract from Red Bull. So it'll come down to what it normally comes down to. You secure your place based on your level, and if it comes down to Russell versus Antonelli, it'll be who performs better in 25 with the offset for Antonelli's inexperience.
Yeah, the point about how you extract Max from the Red Bull contract is valid, but assuming that can be taken care of, even if Russell did really well, he could end up in a kind of Sainz style situation where you're kind of performing at your best relative to what people think, and you're eliminating some of your weaknesses. But actually, Merc are just so hyped at the idea of having Verstappen and then their new kid that they're massively excited about. It almost doesn't matter what Russell does in that scenario. He's kind of like, he's in a losing position automatically almost.
He kind of needs that Mercedes next year to be good enough for him to win a few races and score consistent podiums, so that he can just emphatically show what he's capable of in a top car, like on a consistent basis. Because then I think if you factor in his hope, what from the outside looks to be a good relationship with the team, there doesn't seem to be any suggestion of the team getting frustrated with errors or anything like that. So he's well established, feet under the table, knows the score, team knows him. He's one of their own as well, and there is always that kind of like sentimental element, and he's getting the job done. So he's a great reference for Antonelli to bring him on and blah, blah, blah. All of a sudden, that bringing in someone who is not just, it's even if you get him for free because he can walk away from his Red Bull contract for nothing, Verstappen, that salary is going to be absolutely astronomical. You've got that element of it. You've got the fact that Verstappen is a destroyer of teammates as well. So if you really do rate Antonelli, are you going to burn him, go out putting him alongside Verstappen?
It could be Alonso Hamilton 2007 type style.
Yeah, but and I don't think any team has any interest in that really. So I do feel like Russell. The one thing Russell has in his power is do such a good job in 25 that the positives of bringing in Verstappen don't quite outweigh the very small number of negatives, but that can have a lot of weight to them. But I do think, even though that is theoretically in his control, I think it's more in his control if the car's good, because otherwise Merck's not going to learn anything else about him next year.
The car point is a really valid one, because he's probably getting a bit of extra leeway because of how bad Mercedes have been since 22, but now it just looks like the car's properly turning the corner. And I think you wrote, Scott, didn't you, about how actually it's the focus will shift to the drivers and their errors more, because if the car's sorted from this point on and the rest of the season performs well, you can't get away with mistakes on the basis that the car's difficult and I'm having to try extra hard to get more out of it. Actually, you have to reverse that position and be much, much more consistent and driving much more within that fine limit of being quick but not not trying too hard.
The other thing you also have to remember about the Verstappen signing is if you were to bring him in and potentially drop a driver who's performing at a high level, you'd want to know Verstappen's going to be around for a bit as well. And that's one of the big question marks for Verstappen. So you'd want to know that, you'd want to be convinced that he's going to be around for, if he comes in for 26, you'd want him still to be there in 28, really, wouldn't you? That's just, there's all sorts of factors there. But as I always say, it generally comes down to performance, doesn't it? It'll come down to who's better out of Russell and Antonelli. And if they perform exceptionally, then it might make getting Verstappen, strange as it sounds to say it, seem like more trouble than it's worth. Although any team would benefit from having Verstappen because he is an outstanding driver. And I think actually we're going to see more how outstanding Verstappen is over the rest of the season, just as we have in recent races, because things are a bit tighter.
Yeah.
It throws into sharp relief just how outstanding, and he's still performing at that level when he was winning more comfortably. It's just, it didn't need to. It wasn't so clear.
I still think Mercedes will go for it. If there's a sniff, like Toto's already said, anyone would do handstands to get him in their team. So I think that even if it's expensive, I mean, they're used to spending a fortune on Hamilton. Maybe they don't pay him as much now, but certainly when he was, smashing everybody and winning championship after championship, I don't feel like the financial element's an impediment for a team like Mercedes. If they can get Max, I think they'll go for it.
Yeah, very, very likely. And a question related to Verstappen for you, Scott, from Tim Walters. Max repeatedly asserts that any championships after his first are gravy and that he's determined to race in numerous other series before he's too old. If we add to that the persistent rumours of Red Bull's troubled powertrain project, what do you think of the scenario in which Max signs with Mercedes but takes a sabbatical from F1 in 2025? He could race at Le Mans in the 24 hours, clean up at a couple of IndyCar road courses, add to his karting world championships, and generally enjoy life away from all of the aspects of F1 that irritate him. Indeed, given that Max can basically sign with any F1 team anytime he wants, if they can afford him, he could take off 2026 as well and come back when he's certain who has the superior power unit.
Interesting. I think that Verstappen is, and I remember having quite a few conversations with you about this, Ed, at the time. I think Verstappen is really serious about being committed to seeing out his current Red Bull contract, or hanging around in F1 until 2028, and then he's going to seriously evaluate whether he continues beyond it. Because when he first said that, Ed, we had quite a few conversations along the lines of that's kind of what every driver thinks, but the evidence since then has just been, that message, that wasn't just like a one-off message in the moment that, I want to stay here forever, but eventually I'll get tired. It's just been backed up more and more by anti-F1 sentiment by Max, who is fed up of so many elements of F1, and crucially, who does have a sincere desire to do other stuff. He has a proper interest in other forms of driving. I remember talking to him last year about his own race team that is stepping out of, he has involvements in sim racing, but it wants like a proper GT3 project on the go. He's really excited about that. And I said to him, one day, could that grow into something that you do Le Mans with? And he laughed, didn't rule it out, but just said, no, the priority at the moment is I really need to find the right manufacturer, need to find the right categories to compete in. He's so serious about that. Obviously, there's other people looking after it, but he's so interested in these things. I'd be surprised if you saw him rock up at IndyCar or something like that. But he's absolutely the kind of do you remember in the early mid 2000s when Schumacher would turn up in gearbox karting championship races and stuff like that? That's got Verstappen written all over it, that kind of thing. I can absolutely imagine him doing the Nordschleife, in a proper GT3 entry to try and win that. Le Mans feels like an absolute certainty we'll see Verstappen at Le Mans.
He wants to do it with his dad, doesn't he?
He does, but I think he's now
Is that ship sailed?
It's more like
sorry,
he wants the best driver lineup.
Yeah, exactly.
I think Jost today, with the greatest will in the world, isn't quite as quick a driver as he once was, and might be a little bit exposed in, say, a hyperclass one. But if it was to do LMP2 or something that was Pro-Am, because Jost must be old enough to have been downgraded by now.
You'd think so.
I'm not sure exactly where he would shake out, but that's the only scenario where that would work. But hypercars, pros all the way.
It looks intense, the hypercar lineup, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah, but I just think So I think like at the moment he's so singularly focused on winning in F1. He's going to do that in 2024. It's going to be harder than we all thought it would be, but he will win the championship this year. I'm pretty certain of that. 2025, he's got a very good chance of winning it again. Even as Red Bull comes under more pressure, they are in a good position. So there's no reason they should not be title contenders next year at the very least. So he could and should win again in 25, depending on how you look at it. He then has, regardless of whether you think he'll stay with Red Bull or not, he has the pick of the bunch for 26, really, because I genuinely think like there's probably half the teams that have contracted drivers that would probably boot their contracted driver out if they could get Verstappen in the car. So he wants, first and foremost, he wants to stick out the Red Bull contract until 28. The second order of that is that 28, he's done that deal for a reason, and he looks ahead to 28 for a reason. That gives him enough time to scope out the next set of rules, see if he likes it, see where F1's gone and is still going as a championship, and that is the point in which I think he'll move away. I don't think he'll go away early, but I think he'll go away at a point where he can then nicely explore a bunch of options, crucially, as he says, while he's still at his peak as a driver, because he doesn't want to go and do these things for fun as like a postscript to his F1 career. He wants to go and win these other things.
For completeness, I've just got to throw in that I just looked it up. Jos Verstappen's currently a gold, so he needs a downgrade. Gold's not a very useful status.
No,
because obviously
not for a driver that's not good enough.
It's
to
really
be gold anymore, surely.
It's really, are you platinum or silver? But he's 52, so because there's points. I think you have to get to 60 to get the mandatory downgrade. So that even makes it difficult to line up in one of the other classes. So yeah, it's not looking good for an all Verstappen lineup. I'm sure he'd love to do it at some stage. Le Mans might be a little bit too high end to justify doing it though.
Oh, it's all unravelling. The grand plan. I think also on the F1 rules point, I don't think we're starting from a good spot, are we? I get the sense that Max isn't a fan of the general direction that 2026 appears to be going in from the car side.
No, I think part of that is going to be linked to the fact that at the moment it doesn't sound good for his
politics,
his current competitive option. Yeah. You know, assuming he stays with Red Bull and Ford, there's a reason selfishly that Red Bull have been pushing this. We need to change this and this and this about the rules. But there's also the fact that Max doesn't like the direction that F1's gone in with the current cars, and the fact that it's all so much heavier and everything. And while, you know, in theory, if it's achievable, a 30 kilogram reduction on the weight limit for 26 is going to achieve some of that. It doesn't undo what is it? Ed, you know this because you've obviously done the numbers. What is it? Is 150 plus kilos? If you look at, you know, the start with all the fuel on board at the start of the race, that's how much heavier the cars are now versus say 10, 15 years ago, right?
Yeah, it's miles heavier because it's just night and day, completely different now. So
you've got 30 kilos isn't really going to eat into that a huge amount, and he's unconvinced about, you know, the active aero and the role that energy management's going to play, and he's worried that it's become going to be less driver focused and be an engine formula and all of this. So yeah, he's and
borderline F2 speeds. He won't like that either, will he? If the lap times drop
it's not going to be
far,
that slow. So
he'll be like,
yeah, but it's not going to be that bad.
But even if it's too close, you know, like 2016, that kind of era, before they went to the steroidal aerodynamics again, that was partly based on GP2, or if was it F2? I don't know. It was still GP2. It's too close, even if obviously F1 is ahead and pulling ahead. Yeah, like that will be a factor.
Yeah, no, that's fair. But so there are elements about it that genuinely don't chime with him as a racing driver and just what he wants. And then you combine that with all of the other stuff that we know he dislikes: the calendar, the number of street races, the
boring questions,
the extracurricular stuff he has to do with marketing and whatnot. And some of that's aimed at Red Bull, some of that is F1 as a whole. So you do have a driver there who isn't just, you know, drivers are privileged, very well recompensed people in incredibly luxurious positions who moan about things that they shouldn't really be moaning about a lot of the time. But that doesn't also mean that some of it isn't sincere. And with the Verstappen stuff, it is sincere. And that does make a difference. When you're a person who can go and do whatever they want competitively as a racing driver and doesn't need to do anything for money anymore, he does have basically complete freedom to do what he wants. And he doesn't seem chained to it either. Whereas, like, I feel like with a Hamilton or Alonso, it's all they know and all they want to do. I don't get any impression. Like
And Alonso's done the other
tried to
stuff. Yeah, exactly.
But also he's tried to break away from it and still realised he needed to come back.
Yeah.
And then Hamilton, I just don't see doing any other racing outside of F1. He'll go and do other stuff instead. So it just feels to me like for those drivers, like they'll cling to F1 for longer. Whereas I do genuinely believe Verstappen could have a clean break at some point and just go, I'm going to go and do something else.
It would be great to see him taking on some of the other challenges in motorsport as well. Like it's great to see Alonso doing it as well. And it'll just come down to the practicality of it, because as you said, it's got to be right manufacturer, right opportunities, right deals. And even if you're Max Verstappen, you can't necessarily just click your fingers and straight away you drop into whatever drive you want. You pretty much can in F1, but it doesn't necessarily all fall in your lap the way you'd necessarily want it to. But it would be fantastic to see him take on some other categories, and he'd be outstanding in them, no doubt.
You know we love talking stats here at The Athletic. Here's one that's super simple to remember. Discover automatically doubles the cash back you've earned on your credit card at the end of your first year with Cashback Match. That means with Discover, you could turn $150 cash back to $300. That's right, you could put it towards some memorabilia you've had your eye on, or treat yourself to a premium sports network. You earn and Discover doubles. See terms at discover.com/creditcard.
We'll get back to the pod in a moment, but first of all, let me tell you about Grammarly. Email, Google Docs, Slack, you write across multiple platforms and places during your workday, so delivering consistent, high-quality communication everywhere is key. Grammarly is an AI writing partner that helps you get work done faster with high-quality writing for better projects, proposals, presentations, and more. Best of all, Grammarly works where you work, so you can get more done no matter what tools you use. As a journalist and podcast host, I'm constantly writing and rewriting copy and drawing up scripts. It's part of the job, and Grammarly helps make it faster. It's got some really cool features like tone suggestions to help you strike the right balance between direct and friendly in work emails. Plus, Grammarly has a ton of other great features like advanced spelling, grammar, punctuation, and conciseness suggestions to ensure your writing is professional, mistake-free, and clear. Get AI writing support that works where you work. Sign up and download for free at grammarly.com/podcast. That's GRAMMARLY.com/podcast. Easier said, done.
Ryan Reynolds here from Mint Mobile. With the price of just about everything going up during inflation, we thought we'd bring our prices down. So to help us, we brought in a reverse auctioneer, which is apparently a thing.
Mint Mobile Unlimited Premium Wireless. How to get 30, 30, how to get 30, how to get 20, 20, 20, how to get 20, 20, how to get 15, 15, 15, 15, just $15 a month? Sold!
Give it a try at mintmobile.com/switch.
$45 up front for 3 months plus taxes and fees. Promo rate for new customers for limited time. Unlimited more than 40 gigabytes per month. Slows full terms at mintmobile.com.
Well, let's move on to a set of questions that are Red Bull driver related, Scott. First up from Nabil. Did Red Bull renew Sergio Perez's contract too early?
I think so. I've said that on different podcasts, and we've written stuff that we've done. I have absolutely no objection to Checo being kept on there if he is the best competitive option. And I think there's an argument, well, you can certainly make the argument that Daniel Ricciardo hasn't done anything competitively to show that he would be a better option for Red Bull than Perez. With the way that we've come to know the Red Bull teams, it still surprises and frustrates me that Tsunoda won't get the chance there, just purely because he's clearly just not seen as, for whatever reason, a Red Bull Racing caliber driver as the whole package, which just I still don't fully understand. And so in that situation, you could go, okay, well, retaining Perez is maybe the lesser of all evils. It's a known quantity. It has continuity within it. Despite tensions in the past, it does seem to sort of work all right with Verstappen, and it certainly doesn't put too much pressure on Verstappen, so maybe you get the best out of him and blah, blah, blah. But if that's the case, you don't need to make this decision now, and you don't need to make it when he's struggling for form. And he only went and underlined that with how he performed at the Canadian Grand Prix. So it just smacks of there are non-competitive, non-performance related reasons for doing this. That's the only reason you'd have done it now. For me, this is something that could easily have been done in the second half of the season, maybe, let's say, September time, because that's when I think they need to decide on what they do with Liam Lawson. I think that's when they've got an option on Lawson for 25 that elapses or not. So then that's when they need to decide, Ricciardo or Lawson in the RB. But then by then you've got a load of data on whether Ricciardo's turned things around massively and Perez is nosediving or whatever. And you've just got a complete set of data there, or a much bigger sample set of data, to then decide, actually, with Perez, Tsunoda, Ricciardo and Lawson, who gets our free seats? And do any of them get one of them? Should an Isaac Hadjar get the seat because he's doing such a good job in Formula 2 despite a season that's been quite unfortunate at times? It just feels like they unnecessarily expedited a decision that their driver pool means that they didn't need to make. Not now, anyway.
It's the Tsunoda element that's most baffling, because in a performance situation, you would look at it and go, well, that guy's worth a punt. Perez, yeah, he's a known quantity, but that known quantity isn't very impressive, is it? And it's following the same pattern we've seen every time. So again, it just smacks of what Scott was hinting at, some kind of other non-performance element coming into play. And even if that's not the case, the timing is just so baffling, when you could give yourself a lot more, especially as other options in the more conventional market have taken themselves off the table. They've already decided we don't want to pair Verstappen with Alonso. We don't want to pair Verstappen with Sainz. Albon's done his deal with Williams. We're not prepared to work on that anymore. So once you've decided it's within your own pool, there was absolutely no need to do it so soon.
A related question for you now, Ben, from Tim and Gwena, who says, considering Sergio Perez's unfortunate dip around re-signing his contract with Red Bull, what performance metrics and timelines should Red Bull establish to reassess the efficacy of this decision and determine if a mid-contract review or earlier intervention is warranted?
Well, I imagine they'll always be reviewing it. They were constantly giving him the hurry up last year, and if he really plummets, then, and they figure they have got a better option to slot in, they'll do it. We know that they are usually ruthless enough to do that. I suppose the one thing you could say in his defence at the moment is the start to the season was strong, up to and including China. He was delivering pretty much within the parameters they set at the end of last season, which is he has to be within 2 or 3 tenths of Max in qualifying. Obviously, finishing as well as he can, scoring regular podiums, roughly being in position to capitalise if Max hits trouble. Yeah, he was getting sniped by, Lando Norris doing an amazing job in the McLaren in China, for example, but he was there or thereabouts. Miami even was okay. The race was a bit disappointing, but the qualifying was fine. And then Imola seems to have been the kind of inflection point. The car's changed a bit. It does seem like Red Bull generally has struggled a bit more from that race on. Maybe it's just specifically related to the suspension and its interaction with those circuit types and the curves, but it could be more than that. It could be that they have developed into a place, as we've seen before, the car gets more difficult. Max is able to kind of get his head around it. It looks like it's more difficult than it's been in the past, even so. And Perez just, once things get harder, just isn't able to extract the same level of performance. But it has only been, Imola, Monaco. Even in Monaco, when he went out in Q1, he was within the 0.3 margin of Max in that segment. So he was, it's a generous justification given the result, but you could say performance-wise, he's kind of still roughly there. But yes, it's only been kind of 3 races really, and the car has changed a lot. So they'll probably be looking at it going, well, we've made his life harder. Can we find a way that doesn't take all of a season and a winter like it did last time to get him back on an even keel? So Barcelona is a big test, because that was a really, really bad turning point for Perez 12 months ago. And obviously on the more conventional tracks like Barcelona, you'd expect the Red Bull to be stronger than it has been recently. So if Perez is back to his kind of, Japan level of performance relative to Max, then this will probably go away relatively easily. But if we see the same kind of form we've seen in the last few races on the outlier, not so strong tracks for Red Bull, then it just puts this strange decision from a timing point of view back into questionable territory.
And another question about the Red Bull driver ecosystem from Daniel Creekhouse that I'll take. With VCARB confirming Yuki Tsunoda's extension, is there any chance they pass on Liam Lawson for 2025? And if so, what chances does he have of a seat outside of RB's stables? And Justin Harwood, a Kiwi, asks what the hell is going on with RB and national hero and obviously faster than Daniel Ricciardo, Liam Lawson. And we'll also include Lonnie Redioff's question here, which is when will Liam Lawson be announced and Ricciardo replaced? Well, yes, there is a chance they pass on Lawson, and his chances outside of Red Bull don't look great. I guess Alpine would be the one that would be most likely because there's no Audi interest, and Haas will want an experienced driver to put alongside Ollie Behrman. So that would mean Bottas, Ocon, or perhaps even a reprieve for Kevin Magnussen.
But Alpine would go doing though, wouldn't they? If they're going to put a youngster in, they'd take their own rather than Lawson, surely.
Well, probably, yeah. But there's also the vague chance that Gasly might move on as well, so that they could have two available. It's but
two young guns.
Alpine's the only driver situation where it could evolve to include Lawson. I don't think it will, but that's just possible. But in terms of whether RB run Lawson, it seems to be becoming less likely that they do it during 2024, which was a possibility. Helmut Marko seemed to be quite keen on that one. So I think it becomes a question of whether Ricciardo continues with RB next year. And Lawson's 5-race stint last year showed he's eminently capable of doing a decent job in F1. And you could certainly argue that earns him a shot, but it'll depend on whether they want to keep Ricciardo or not. And I think that will connect up to some of those wider reasons for driver decisions being taken at Red Bull that Scott alluded to earlier. So yeah, it's very
well. Also,
very...
specifically Ricciardo's commercial profile, right? There's an element there where the off track he's just an asset far and away bigger than Lawson could be.
Yeah.
So as long as Ricciardo's performing sort of well enough, he might get leeway, even if objectively you might say, "Oh, it's time to replace him."
Yeah, it makes it very tricky for Lawson because it looked like his performances last year meant that he was pretty much guaranteed a place in 25, but it seems very, very up in the air at the moment, so he might feel a little bit frustrated about that, but that's the nature of F1.
Wouldn't be the first time, would it, in F1?
Exactly. Scott, a question from Connor Williams. After the contract extension for Tsunoda at VCARB for next year, do you think he'll eventually get out of the Red Bull family after 2025? And if so, is Aston Martin one of the best possibilities in 2026 when Honda joins them?
Yeah, it depends. It's really tied to whether or not Tsunoda's place can be saved without Honda being there. So for this year, for his seat in 2024, Honda was absolutely critical for that because obviously they were set on keeping Ricciardo for a full season. But Lawson did such a good job as a stand-in that Marko got very excited about putting him in full-time. But Honda came in at the last minute and basically, as I understand it, basically upped the financial contribution that they make in having Tsunoda in that seat. So Tsunoda got into the team in the first place by virtue of being a quite Red Bull junior but brackets Honda backed driver. His performances weren't completely convincing early on. We all know that, but that Honda backing helped keep him in. Since then, his performances merit that seat. He just also happens to come with a nice sweetener from Honda, and then Red Bull was able to get an even bigger sweetener from Honda because there were other drivers in the mix. As it stands for 25, the reason Tsunoda's been confirmed now is because there's interest from other teams, and they had
the
option.
Hands off, wasn't it?
Yeah, they had the option to take up, and he is hands down after Verstappen the second best Red Bull driver on the grid at the moment.
Agree.
So there's no brainer to keep him. Beyond 25, when there isn't that kicker from Honda as well, where you don't know if Ricciardo's still going to be performing, Perez if they keep their Red Bull Racing lineup, blah blah blah, Lawson as well. You don't know what the picture's going to be. They might need Tsunoda, Red Bull, as a driver for either team, and therefore be willing to just go, okay, well, just on pure performance terms, he is our driver and he's really good, so let's keep him. But they might be bafflingly and unexpectedly flush with options and then decide, actually, we don't want him if Honda aren't here anymore, there's no point in keeping him, or we've lost a big argument to keep him. In that situation, the ideal scenario for Tsunoda is to go and race for the Honda Works team, but that depends on whether Alonso and Stroll are still in those seats. We know that Alonso will be for 26. Stroll, he's there indefinitely until something changes. So then it's a question of whether Tsunoda has to go somewhere else as a sort of stopgap while he waits for one of those Aston Honda seats to become available. So it's not the it's not the easiest sort of path to plot for him at the moment. And I wrote this the other day that he deserves more than to be in this kind of almost career limbo kind of situation right when his stock is at its highest.
He's making a good case for himself though now, isn't he? Like it's switched around from basically it's will Red Bull keep him or will he just drop out of F1 to actually, I know this is a guy that would be of interest to other teams if he keeps his current level up, even if the Red Bull RB thing peters out eventually, that he will be a strong contender for another team. He'll just be more contractually available than he was this time.
Next up, a question for you, Ben, from Oliver Emerson. Based on Mexico 23, Miami 24 and Canada 24, is there growing evidence that Ricciardo's qualifying ceiling with a high-performing car remains higher than Tsunoda's despite a poor run of form this season? Does Ricciardo raise the ceiling of performance whilst Tsunoda raises the floor?
Oh, that's a good question. I think it certainly can look that way superficially. I think it's also tempting to just see those peaks from Ricciardo and get slightly overexcited about them, in as well as he did in Mexico 23, and it was a fantastic performance. Tsunoda wasn't qualifying the car that day. I think he helped Ricciardo, didn't he? He had to tow him because he had an engine change, I think, so was starting near the back. And then in the race, actually Tsunoda drove a really strong race until he clattered Oscar Piastri. So it was messy, but performance-wise, there wasn't a huge difference underlying, I think, between Ricciardo and Tsunoda. Similar in Miami this year, Ricciardo had that brilliant sprint where he almost was on the podium. But obviously for Grand Prix qualifying and the Grand Prix itself went missing, and actually Tsunoda turned around his weekend and was, stronger. So there you had a kind of, I guess, equilibrium. I remember Scott saying, I think, on the podcast that RB had a great weekend. It was just that only one driver was doing the business on any given part of that weekend. And Canada, similar kind of story. Again, good weekend from Ricciardo, but Tsunoda was, as you explained, I think, on the post-race pod, Ed, underlying faster. He just messed up turn 2, didn't he, in qualifying? But actually the rest of the lap was quicker, so should have qualified probably ahead of Ricciardo. And in the race was there until he made an error. So, but again, performance-wise, it's not like Ricciardo's doing things that Tsunoda can't. More often, it's that Tsunoda's doing things that Ricciardo can't match. And then when the stars align, the tyres are in the right window, or Ricciardo's feeling good, he can get to that level. The problem is he's not getting to that level often enough. Where I think he is and has made a contribution in terms of that, raising the floor maybe rather than the ceiling, or how would you phrase it? Maybe he is raising the ceiling. Is on the wider aspect. Tsunoda has talked about learning from Ricciardo in terms of working with the team, how to set the car up. Ricciardo's maybe a bit more sensitive to that, drives it in a different way. So in some ways, he's probably helped Tsunoda to step on. But I don't think that he's really doing anything, as he admits, that raises hairs with that car that Tsunoda can't do.
For the next question, I'm going to get a little bit of outside help because we've got a specialist on this particular subject. So I'm going to welcome Glenn Freeman now for this question from Gareth Moore. Jacques Villeneuve was at his attention-seeking best, or worst, in Canada, criticising Daniel Ricciardo. Also, I find it funny he couldn't take the stick when it was given back to him. I'm too young to have seen Villeneuve in his heyday back in the 1990s and 2000s. Was his peak that much better than Ricciardo's back in the Red Bull days? I know from Bring Back V10s that Villeneuve was far from a faultless driver back in the day, despite Glenn Freeman's efforts.
This is a great question because while clearly there's quite a strong degree of truth to what Villeneuve said about Ricciardo at the moment, where he let himself down, as you guys have discussed on a podcast previously, is by kind of doing down the rest of Ricciardo's career, the early years, the peak years, when arguably Ricciardo was at times the best driver on the grid before. As he said, he loved the 2016 generation of cars and he flew in those. So the way I interpret this question really is, would or could Ricciardo have had the career achievements that Villeneuve did when he was in the best car on the grid? So could Ricciardo have had the season Villeneuve had in 96, coming second in the championship in the best car, with limited experience? Yes, I think he could, for 4 race wins. Could he have won the championship at Ricciardo's peak? Could he have won the championship in 1997 in what was usually the best car on the grid? I think absolutely. I think he drove that well at that time that he could have. So, yeah, yes, I think Villeneuve was better at his peak than he gets credit for now, because people know him as this guy who spouts off stuff like this, and people maybe remember the latter part of his career either in F1 or after F1, and that's the other funny thing, isn't it? Even I can admit that if you're looking for someone who's maybe got an expert first-person perspective on an F1 career that maybe went on a bit too long, sadly, it probably is Jacques Villeneuve.
Well, thanks for that from Glenn. Next up is a question I'll take from Ross Dawson. Why have Red Bull become so conservative with the use of their young driver programme? Lawson is clearly fast, yet Perez and Ricciardo seem to have the preference. Is it all down to commercial reasons these days? There's an element of the commercial side, but I think ultimately the Red Bull driver scheme has never been especially strategic. And I do think that's put some, I do think that's put some pressure on it.
What a controversial opinion.
Well, exactly. Yeah. Now everyone has got a young driver program. It's not quite right to say Red Bull was ever the only show in town, but it was certainly a bigger slice of the young driver program market.
It had it easier, didn't it? And now it has to work a bit harder. Yeah, can't be so scattergun.
Exactly. Yeah. There's less competition. You know, F1 teams, the serious ones, they're scouting very aggressively in karting now, and the sell to these young drivers is starting very, very early, and it's much less about sudden talent spotting, as it's a bit like the way scouting's gone in football. It's now very, very thorough and scientific, and that level of application is there. And I'm not sure Red Bull have caught up with that. Certainly in terms of the selection process, they bring a lot of science to the training.
No, Helmut Marko is very data driven, Ed, famously so.
Well, there's different types of data. He uses his type of data, and to be fair, they've picked some great drivers over the years and developed some really important drivers. There's drivers all over the place in the professional ranks who've been Red Bull drivers,
but they could afford to pit more of them against each other, couldn't they, in the past when they had their pick? Now you have to, like as you've outlined, you have to make your selection much more specifically with a much better defined set of criteria and a much greater pitch.
Exactly, yeah. And I think the big problem is, obviously, we've talked about how Verstappen, in terms of who they want to pair him with, Perez fits quite well in that regard, and I don't think they want to throw an underprepared young driver into that. And obviously, Tsunoda. He
broke two of them, didn't he?
Exactly. Yeah.
Verstappen's kind of literally broken their whole mould, not only in terms of how they got him into F1 via the scheme, but also then with the subsequent drivers they promoted, because he squashed a couple of guys who've actually turned out to be very strong leading midfield drivers in other teams. So if they couldn't hack it, what chance has some, super young guy with no experience at all got?
Yeah, exactly. And ultimately, it's only really in the past few months that Tsunoda's become someone who's performing at a credible level for serious consideration. So they haven't really had one to put in there. And yeah, certainly they talk about RB being a second team rather than a junior team and all that kind of rhetoric. So that's part of it. But I just think they're a little bit...
That's where Ricciardo fits really well, isn't it?
Yeah, exactly.
Specific idea.
Yeah, he does fit very well in there. And I think it partly comes down to the fact that Lawson's clearly good. I don't think there's a feeling within Red Bull that Lawson's future world champion material, so that takes the pressure off having to force him in. Isaac Hadjar's doing a very good job in F2. He's certainly someone they'll be looking to promote. So I think it's just down to that confluence of circumstances. And everyone who's got a young driver program struggles with this. Red Bull's in the best possible position because it's got 4 seats and what was a junior team and they claim isn't, but still ultimately is. So it's still quite hard within that. So I think, a lack of strategy, the fact it is quite difficult, and the unique set of circumstances of the drivers they've got, I think all adds up to that happening. And commercial is a small part of it, certainly for Ricciardo. I think Perez brings commercial benefits, but I think it would be a mistake to say that's the primary reason for Perez being at Red Bull. I think that's an additional bonus to having him. So I think that's just the way of things with Red Bull, and it's going to remain with that kind of character as long as Helmut Marko's in charge of it, with all the benefits and the negatives that brings. Well, let's get on to our final batch of questions for this podcast. Scott, a question for you from Adam Barton. At what point will Sauber start to benefit from the association with Audi? Are they at risk of being the latest car company throwing tens of millions at F1 to end up in the lower midfield?
Good to know that Adam Barton is the name that Carlos Sainz goes by when he submits questions on his burner account. Because I think these might be the 2 exact questions Carlos Sainz has been asking for the last few weeks, because it does feel a little bit like that, doesn't it? It's like, okay, where is it? Where's the progress? Where are the advantages? So,
Dad, I know they were really good for you in the other categories, but I'm not really seeing it in my category.
Come on, prove it then. So I think there are specific problems within Sauber that we're always going to take time to see advantages from. And you weren't going to actually have that completely finished, even by 26. That first 2, maybe 3 years of Audi would still be spent refining areas of that team that still aren't quite that of a top team. The problem is that there are elements at the moment that are just quite concerning in terms of the rate of development being too slow, the lack of understanding of limitations and how to fix them, more importantly. So that sort of the place that I would be quite concerned about at the moment. I mean, they're the new manufacturer coming in, not just as a company buying a team, but also doing their own engine as well. And I would back Audi to get there sooner or later on the engine side, because it is a very, very serious organisation with fantastic pedigree, great technology, and serious investment in that engine facility. But we've seen that this is not a rule set, an engine rule set that is easy to just come in and succeed from the start. They might not necessarily be as disastrous as Honda were at the beginning, but that is a cautionary tale. And despite the rules being simplified with no MGUH for 2026, these engines are still not easy. In fact, they might be as hard in their own way because of the change in the balance between the V6 and the uprated MGUK. So this is not simple at all. And I think Adam's questions get to the heart of the fact that this is a long-term project, very possibly a longer-term, slower turnaround than Audi would have hoped for when it planned to buy Sauber. And even last year, when Andreas Seidel was telling them, you need to do more sooner, maybe they still haven't quite fully grasped it. But if they didn't before, they will now. They must know, there must be alarm bells ringing to a degree in Germany and in Switzerland about where this team is at and how much work still needs to be done.
Ben, a question from Chris Parrott for you. Are we finally seeing the convergence of performance at the front of the field that the regulations promised?
Well, we are seeing the convergence at the front of the field. Did the regulations promise that? I suppose all regulations promise.
Yeah, they specifically talked about that being one of the objectives. Yeah.
Okay, good. Yeah, well, yes, in that case we are. You know, Red Bull seem to be, as we've talked about before, maybe starting to hit diminishing returns. Certainly, they've not kicked on with their first kind of major in-season development compared to kind of where it looked like they might be when they launched that radical-looking car. Ferrari are doing well. McLaren are now in the fight. Mercedes seem to be kind of getting themselves on track. So, yeah, it's great. And I guess we just have to enjoy it while it lasts until everything gets ripped up again for 2026.
Exactly, yeah, there's a general trend there. A question from Darren Donald. Assuming the Spanish Grand Prix gives us the best idea of where the cars currently rank in order of pace, are there any other tracks with a similar profile later in the season that we can use to have the best idea of the running order? Yeah, Spain's very good because it's a very aero track, but it's also got a pretty good range of corner speed profiles, which is a good test of these cars. So, yeah, Hungary's pretty good for that sort of low-medium speed measure. Zandvoort will give you a reasonable low-speed measure as well. Cota's quite a good all-round track, I would say. They're probably the ones that stand out as broad tests. But I'd say Spain's probably the best of them just for that blend of different corner characteristics. Maybe it's fractionally less so than it used to be now that the chicane isn't in there, but I think people prefer it without the chicane anyway, so that's an acceptable loss.
Teams knowing it inside out helps as well, doesn't it? Because there are fewer variables from their side in terms of having a deep understanding of what setups work, etc.
Yeah, exactly. Even though they're not testing there anymore in terms of the pre-season testing it yet, it's very, very well known. A question for you, Scott, from Ben Lacey. Is Ferrari's Canada form a cause for concern given their history of failing upgrades during the season?
No, I don't think so for that reason, because I'm not sure it's related to that. I think there were obviously some issues that, as we record this, they might still be in the process of fully troubleshooting and understanding. It was a weekend that just, I think, had multiple small errors and problems within them, but in every kind of crucial phase of the weekend. So it was a proper everything that can go wrong does go wrong. They didn't get the car in a good place. I don't think they set the car up very well for the wet conditions. It's probably not the best track for them in terms of engine characteristics. They misjudged with the competitiveness of their car. they misjudged their tyre strategy in Q2. McLaren made the same strategy work in terms of using one set, but McLaren clearly had a faster car than Ferrari had. So maybe in hindsight, Ferrari should have played that slightly differently and been a bit more cautious. And then in the race, obviously, they had an engine problem for Leclerc that they were finally able to reset, but by that point, the race was long gone. So they did a ultimately futile tyre gamble, but it was based on, we've got nothing to lose here, so why not? So I think there's so much that went wrong. The best thing about it for Ferrari is that Fred Vasseur, with a very calm head, who seeks neither congratulations when things go well nor panic when things go badly. He's probably the best possible leader you could have after a weekend like that, because he'll probably pick through the debris and worked out kind of, okay, how much of this is actually worth worrying about? How much of this has an easy fix? How much of this needs a deeper look? And I have a bit more faith than I've had in previous years that Ferrari is actually capable of doing that. And the core thing is that I don't think there's like oh crap, have we taken a massive backward step with the car all of a sudden and now we're lost on development? I don't think it's that.
Ben, a question from Andrew Sillett. Is it time for Alpine and Ocon to shake hands and call it a day?
Well, they have, haven't they? At least they claim they've shaken hands. But certainly they're calling it a day. I presume the question implies mid-season, just call it quits now. I mean, the way it's going with the Monaco fallout and what was agreed pre-race or what wasn't agreed, Ocon insisting I follow instructions all the time, then him getting kind of shafted by the team, really. I think that's
the world's most pointless team order.
Yeah, with a really badly handled team order, as we discussed post-race at length. It doesn't look good, because imagine how much more is happening behind the scenes when it's playing out this badly in public. It's completely toxic, isn't it? So if they can find a way to just work together to see out the season, because it does seem like the Alpine performance-wise isn't too bad at the moment. There are points on the table to be had, so they do need to be kind of all going in the same direction. The question, of course, is if you decide Ocon is now that he's off, too much trouble, more trouble than he's worth, who do you slot in? There isn't really anyone readily available other than if they're going to promote early their academy driver, Jack Doohan, and that seems, it's possible, but it's risky. Is he going to be able to extract the same performance from the car that Ocon can? I guess it has to be more about, if you feel like Ocon is still going to perform better than Doohan would, just find some way to put your differences aside and work for the remainder of the season. There are other drivers in the position who know they're going long before the season's finished and they're managing to get by. So it's doable. I just don't know if the relationship is repairable at this stage. To that level, to be able to do that.
Next up, a question from Andrew Loveland. As a fan and regular attendee of the Canadian Grand Prix, I think the circuit being one of the few parkland tracks is an important part of the calendar. However, I've recently heard from some fellow Canadians that they think F1 has outgrown the track due to the fact they have to bring in barges to facilitate the paddock. The drivers seem to enjoy the track, but do you think it still has a place in modern F1? Yeah, it has a place in modern F1. It's a good track. I don't really have a problem with them using barges. However, it is one of the most poorly organised on the calendar. We also saw there was the problem with the track invasion. It has a feeling of a declining race that's increasingly out of kilter with the rest of F1. I don't know why Liberty Media seem happy with it. Every year the organisation seems to get worse. It's a shame because it's a cracking event. Certainly it used to be. But just as an example, there's always going to be limitations about the size and the location. Obviously, you've got to get everyone across onto the Ile Notre Dame. That creates problems, and races have a volume of traffic issue that no amount of management can solve.
It's Edd Straw podcast bingo. Now we're talking about the travel logistics.
Exactly. But but to give you an example of how poorly done it seems to be now, if you go in really early, which I tend to do, when there's very little traffic, they create queues but just with poor organisation and being very slow on checking passes on cars. And it's like they're creating traffic where there shouldn't be any. So you think what it's like 3 hours later when there's loads of cars trying to get there. And I just think it's that thing of, does the promoter feel like they actually care about the race? And they don't. It's not a race I'd recommend people go to now, because it's also one where you get if your hotel doesn't get cancelled 2 or 3 times when you pre-book it, and they decide they can charge someone else twice as much and cancel and say, "Oh no, it was a technical issue," which is last few years keeps happening to me. So you've got that. All of this just means it's not one I recommend, and it's such a shame because it's a great race. I'd like it to stay on the calendar, but I'd like to see the evidence the promoters taking it seriously, because they don't seem to. And the fact, the track invasion thing, and obviously they've had problems with that going back years. I just find it very odd that there just seems a lack of care and attention that's very out of kilter. And what's more, it's not just that race becoming out of date. I think in isolation, its organisation has regressed from where it was.
It's a great rant, but also just to back it up so it doesn't just sound like a particular Edd grievance after a bad 2024 weekend. It is one that it is probably it's in the top 3 races, I think, for me, for one where when we work out our logistics for the season, I'm very, very happy to say I'm not doing that race because it has only got worse. I've heard it from multiple people. And the experiences I had when I did that race, it was very much the kind of manifestation of the worst things about races over the course of the season. And I don't think it's handled the sort of swell of F1 over the last few years particularly well. It has become so much bigger in and of itself, F1, that the events then need to sort of catch up with that. And we've talked. There are a handful of races on the calendar that don't do a very good job, and they let the fans down. As a result of that.
What a shame, because Canada used to be one of the top 5 to go to, definitely, as a reporter.
Absolutely, I remember it was one of the highlights, and it's gone from one of the highlights to one of the worst. And obviously, you've not done Canada on site for a few years, man, so it's probably slightly surprising.
I am.
This, because
I'm a bit surprised.
Let's say you don't. There's always limitations, and there'll be a bit of traffic at certain times, but I don't feel they're making the best of it. And I'd be interested to know what it's like, because obviously I'm always very aware that we're not the fan in the grandstand. So it may be that it's great for the fans who go and they're listening to us thinking, "Oh, you're just overprivileged idiots." In which case, great, because
they'd be right.
It's great because it should be a great event to go to. It should be a proper festival race. It's a unique location, a unique track, loads of history. It's got everything really, but I have a suspicion that it's quite awkward for fans as well.
Some apparently got burned by general admission areas having bits of fence that you could watch through being covered over.
Yeah,
because it was decided by Sunday that wasn't a view that those people had paid for, which has happened at a couple of races in the Liberty era, and it might well be coincidence and individual promoter decisions, but it doesn't feel like that to me. I don't remember this kind of thing happening before, and that's a proper stain on what you give the fans. It's an indictment of promoters and the championship.
Yeah, I'd certainly agree with that. It's there's lots of talk about how valuable the fans are and they love having them, but they really only see them as a source of income, and that's understandable. It's a business, but you need to look after the fans, and that seems pretty extreme to do that. And things like general admission areas and where you can watch from, that's stuff that's all in the plan. It shouldn't change. Is it safe for them to watch there or not? Does it work with both the track safety and the footfall behind it? That stuff they should know. So that's another example of that. So yes, great race. I hope it stays on the calendar, and I hope they get it sorted. But you can't purely rely on history. It's got a bit of a feel of where Silverstone was, say, 15 years ago, and it was a pretty miserable race to attend. And they have sharpened up quite a lot over recent times. It's become a much better race because of it. So there's a template for Montreal. It's got a question for you from Paul Balkazak, who says, would you consider turning the sympathy corner into an item applicable for all the drivers? For this race, I would nominate Charles Leclerc for Canada.
I am loving the suggestion from Paul that I have the power to decide this. In your face, Ed, you must be reeling from this question.
Well, I feel like Valtteri Bottas sympathy corner is partly your thing. You're normally the one that leads us there, so I don't have a problem with that. I'm happy with that.
It's probably something we have to do off podcast, really, but it'd be fun to play a game of which drivers do we think would actually engage in doing a sympathy corner jingle.
The problem is that Valtteri Bottas has just got a lock on sympathy corner at the moment.
Yeah, that's the thing.
He's just not moving. So he's resolute.
The beauty of sympathy corner as its own thing with Valtteri is that it's something that we had absolutely no intention of rolling out as much as we did, and it sort of became it was like I love that it's now an in-joke that he's aware of and has bought into and has absolutely zero problem with. That's beautiful, because it was never something that was done out of like malice or anything like that. And so I don't think it would quite work if it was then this kind of broad thing, because then it's kind of just, it's a segment. And I know that it has that vibe already because Bottas is having such an unfortunate season, but that only kind of enhances the value of Sympathy Corner, because then when it disappears for a race or two, and we still we've avoided saying too much about this, haven't we, Ed? But we're both really hoping he gets a result, because it's going to be fun when he gets a result. There's a little something in mind for that.
Yeah, it did, and it'd just be nice not to be in Valtteri Bottas Sympathy Corner. We didn't visit that after the Canadian Grand Prix, but we might have done. It's just that Sauber being a bit rubbish has just become standard. Wasn't
it Zhou Guan Yu Sympathy Corner after Canada? I struggled into the corners, out of the corners, basically, with everything.
Exactly. He would have probably spun at Sympathy Corner, to be honest, with the weekend that he had.
I think the big question will be eventually when Valtteri Bottas moves on from Formula One. I don't think that's going to be at the end of this year. I suspect he'll have a drive next year. I think he's too good not to. But there is the question of whether Sympathy Corner gets retired or whether it becomes open for somebody else to occupy, or even become a free-for-all.
So that's a big claim to move it on to someone else specifically.
We might have to retire the shirt.
Yeah, or that's when it becomes its own segment, and then we can do what Paul suggested and nominate an individual. Which, by the way, one final thing I would say, Leclerc would be a great nomination for the Canadian Grand Prix weekend for that.
Yeah, I'd certainly agree with that. Ben, next up a question from Ed Barnard. Does the safety car have intermediate or wet tyres for changeable conditions, or does it have an all-purpose tyre similar to those you would see on a road car?
Well, I am reliably informed that it has one tyre designed for all weathers.
Well, it's got four.
Not four.
Well, it's got four tyres. It doesn't just use one.
we both went exactly the same way.
That's where we've got to now. Yes.
It's been recording for over an hour. I don't think it's our fault.
It's four tyres of one specification, which is designed for all weathers. It's not quite the sort of cut slick track day tyre, because obviously it has to handle proper rain. But yes, it's a Pirelli all weather road tyre, I think.
Yeah, it's sort of fast road tyre, so it's quick. But yeah, you wouldn't really want to have to do quick pit stops for the safety car. You can imagine how chaotic that would be if there's a sudden downpour or something, and we've got to get it off slicks onto
or they don't get the wheel attached and they have to bring it back in or park it.
Unsafe release, Burton Highlander.
It's funny enough when you see in like IndyCar, for example, when they have like really heavy pace car races and it has to get refueled. Like that is already funny enough. If you had to then watch in a safety car in an F1 race getting pit stops to change tyres, it's kind of light rain. We don't know. Can we actually handle it with the cut slick that we have at the moment? Do we need full wets? And you have a whole.
We've picked the wrong strategy. He's in the barrier.
Exactly.
Send out the backup.
You'd have situations where instead of the safety car missing the lead car misses the safety car because it hasn't come out in time.
And you could throw a virtual safety car for the fact the safety car's had a crash that necessitates a safety car.
Oh, there's so much. There's fertile ground here.
What tyres is the virtual safety car on?
They've got 4.
Notional simulated tyres.
It could be whatever you want because it's virtual. So
they don't have overheating problems with those tyres. Right, a question now from Phil Kent that I'll take. It seems the combination of the cost cap and damage repair bills is having a material effect on the racing, either with drivers backing off or development plans being thrown into disarray, sometimes through no fault of the driver if caught up in another's accidents. What would the implications and support be for removing accident damage from the cost cap, although allowing only exact replacement parts to avoid any minor deliberate actions? Well, yeah, you're kind of hinting at some of the problems there. You would start to get question marks of, do people not necessarily deliberately damage things, but you can claim things are damaged. You can say, look, we've analysed this, we've x-rayed this, there's a crack, you might not need it. And a lot of monitoring in terms of replacement parts, because it's not just the look of parts, it'll be the structure as well. So it creates a few problems there.
Well, Ferrari tried, didn't they? When they got hit by the drain in Vegas, there was that whole clamour of, we should be compensated because the circuit broke.
I don't know how that got resolved.
I don't think it did. It doesn't sound like it got resolved in Ferrari's favour, because surely they would have said.
No, I think there was some kind of I don't know for sure, but they were pushing for also some kind of literal money settlement with the organisers as well. So
maybe it was just that.
I suspect that will have happened, but I think probably cost. I mean, ultimately, cars get damaged, and you always have to have a damage contingency. I actually think it slightly exaggerated the impact for the big teams, maybe.
Well, it did hurt Sainz, didn't it? At the end of that season, I think the car he had in Abu Dhabi was basically like a taped together, ragtag bunch of parts, wasn't it? On the basis that they were up at the limit and they didn't have the money to give him basically a new car for the final race. It wasn't worth it.
Yeah, I mean, it certainly has an effect, but also there used to be limits there of budget and that kind of thing. It's just people are more happy to talk about it now because there would have been times where teams have not had parts and they've not talked about it because this time there's an external
force.
An excuse. There's a cost gap, we can't spend this. Whereas you don't want to send, we didn't have the money to do this because then you sound like a bit of a cheap F1 team, if you see what I mean.
Who could that have been in the past?
I would say
you do, yeah.
There's more of an effect for the big teams at the front, the ones that would have unlimited money. But let's not pretend Williams won't have had this problem before the cost cap because they absolutely would have done. It's just the nature of the beast, and then the question of patching together parts rather than replacing them completely, etc. So it's not completely new. It is right. It's shifted things a little bit, particularly for the big teams. But yeah, I think removing accident damage from the cost cap has an appeal because it's a movable number. But also teams have to have a contingency for parts wastage and damage and that kind of thing. So that's part of it. So yeah,
and it won't help the small teams, will it? It'll only help the big teams. Yeah. So you just recreate that wedge that you've been trying to get away from by having the cost cap in the first place.
Exactly, and then you get the question of where's the bar for replacing items because you would get
the old reliability engine fixes.
Exactly.
Oh
and
yes, okay.
The other problem is if you're a team that's got a lot of money and you can have a pot for extra stuff, you'll think, okay, right, well, we will design this part to fatigue after this amount of time rather than this amount of time, whereas teams down the back having to say, well, the life on this part, this is all, they've got great control over the design of every part on that car and the aero parts and that kind of thing. So you play to the rules.
It's one where the rule makers can't be so specific, actually, isn't it?
Exactly.
It's better to have the blunt instrument of this is your budget, you do what you want.
Exactly, yeah, exactly. And it's perfectly achievable. Obviously, you get in trouble if you have lots of big crashes, but that's the case of even before the cost cap. You had big trouble if you had lots of big crashes. It just becomes a slightly different framing for the conversation. Scott, a question from Tom Knights. Is this the weekend that ended the chances of Joe and Sargent getting a drive next season? Sargent with a very messy race, Joe with very poor pace in qualifying, and the race and 2 trips to the wall in the practice sessions.
I don't think there's ever any kind of like binary moment for drivers like that. The decision's already been made to move them on. It's going to take an extraordinary turn of events for Joe to end up staying at Sauber next year, and it's likewise for Sargent and Williams. The Williams is actively going around now publicly stating it has number 1 picks for next year and it wants Sainz, and if it doesn't get Sainz, it's going to have Bottas or whoever. So, but it won't be him. These kind of weekends just underline that. For Joe, it was a manifestation of all the things that car has done to him this year in terms of sapping his confidence, bringing out the worst in him, showcasing the worst in the car, and just how bad that's going in his third season. And for Sargent, it was a microcosm of his F1 career to date, which is even when he's in difficult circumstances, he's actually capable of performing really well. He's still on a spec difference that he's unhappy with, which is completely understandable because he's not exactly completely responsible for that spec difference. It's a legacy of various crashes in the first part of the year. Albon had more than his fair share of those, and obviously the problems that they've had in car builds and development work and whatnot. So he pieces together a weekend in which he actually looks really quick, and then in qualifying he's pretty much about as far off as he should be with an old floor and all of this. And if you get through that weekend and that's what you've done, then it's a great job. And then he just has a really messy race that he eventually spins and crashes out of. And that just undermines all that came before it, which is Sargent's career in a nutshell, unfortunately, F1 career, because he has had so many bright spots so far. But the problem has been like that always ends up being a reason why he doesn't get the end result or this or that. And there's always just something in there that it just can't quite piece it together. So for both of those drivers, it was a weekend that proved why they're not being kept on rather than was the final straw or anything like that.
Ben, a related question from Thomas Joseph, who was more of a statement, really. Can someone please put Logan Sargent out of his misery? It's so painful to watch. And Eddar Gaming asks if Sargent's place is still secure.
I think if, during that spell where Williams were asking about the feasibility of putting Antonelli in, when it looked maybe more like Antonelli wouldn't necessarily be a shoe-in at Mercedes, Sargent was probably at real risk of being replaced in season, and we talked about that a lot. I think now that it's moving more to Antonelli does his F1 testing in the background and then jumps into the Mercedes straight away next season, that protects Sargent for this year, because there isn't really anyone they've got available to slot in mid-season who would then help them for the following years. As Scott's outlined, they're looking to now they've got Alex Albon tied down, because obviously there was a risk that he might move on, which maybe would have strengthened Sargent's case. Now they've got him tied down, they can just scout around for the best available guy to put in the other seat. And there are options, with these young guys like Antonelli almost certain to come onto the grid, Behrman at Haas, maybe Doohan at Alpine, maybe Lawson at RB. Suddenly, the power is with the team rather than with the driver. And Sargent is just stuck. We know the pace is there, that he's got a turn of speed, but that's it. There's often this idea that you want to take the fast driver and then smooth out the rough edges, but none of the smoothing seems to happen with Sargent. He's quick, he can do a lap, but he can't string it together, and hasn't been able to do it really throughout his time in F1. And now there's just so much more competition for seats. Zhou, I think, is a little bit less quick over one lap, but maybe a bit more rounded. But nevertheless, you can't hide anymore. There's so much pressure from underneath, drivers who are banging on the door to get on the grid, that those guys with the sustained level of underperformance, they just don't have a chance. Yeah,
and Joe putting it in the wall too many times now is really cutting into one of his few USPs. Well, that's not as harsh one of his few. But the great thing about Joe is he works really well with the team. He's intelligent. He's developed well technically. He's well liked in the team. He's consistent. He doesn't make those errors. So could
see him being a reserve driver. Like a reserve driver or test role, whereas Sargent, I just feel like they might do it out of sympathy, but I think Williams would just move on from him. I think it was too much too soon. He wasn't really the best fit. They just sort of did it because they needed someone and hoped it would work out, and it just hasn't.
And the final question I'll take from Via Nikari, who says, are Red Bull's suspension troubles and Newey leaving the team somehow connected? As we know, Newey designed the suspension. Is it, again, Adrian's significant innovations that work on paper amazingly well, but practicality brings great ideas down? Well, yeah, I don't think it's down to him leaving, because this weakness has been there for a long time with Red Bull. It's just exposed a little bit more now. I think the thing is with this is, also, you've got to keep a sense of proportion. Every car will have some limitations, and the nature of these cars means you can trade off where that is. And the fact remains that the car wasn't ideal at Imola. Verstappen still won. It wasn't ideal at Monaco. He still could have qualified second or third and finished on the podium. And it wasn't ideal in Canada, and he still won. And then we're going to go to more conventional circuits. So I don't think it's necessarily a fundamental problem, because you have to remember the limitation that manifests itself sometimes is actually a strength in a lot of other areas, with having to have that lateral stiffness at the rear. So yeah, I don't think the problems reflect the fact that Newey's going. He was still there at Monaco in the garage, wasn't he? So if he's got all the answers, he'd have been able to deploy them. It's just something that's hardwired into the design of the car, and he'll have been aware of some of those compromises when it was designed. And I don't think it's a question of an idea that's too extreme. The interesting question is, as the other teams develop, the question of whether that's the right compromise for the longer term, that's not really answered yet, because it could be that with the approach some of the other teams have got, you can go beyond that as your kind of average performance. Or it could just be that Red Bull on a few tracks that are more outlierish is going to struggle more. And we've got a nice stretch of more conventional tracks coming up now where I would be surprised if Red Bull weren't winning most of them, or at least in the mix to win most of them, if not all of them. So yeah,
they'll just get squeezed on a few more of those outlier tracks now, won't they? Now the field's compressed a bit.
Exactly,
like Max was saying, Monaco, we could get away with the fact that this suspension doesn't work there because everyone else was still so far behind us that we could back off by X% and still be just about ahead. But now you can't do that. So a bit like when Mercedes were always terrible at Singapore in the previous era, you just write that one off and go, well, we do the best we can, salvage as many points as we can. But actually, given the calendar is mostly these kind of high speed circuits that the car's designed for, we'll still be all right in the championship. And that's what you'd expect with Red Bull. They'll just have a few more Singapore 2023 type races than we've been used to.
Yeah, exactly. It's all about the overall compromise, and there's a kind of notional centre point in terms of average performance that's your ideal, and the question is, are Red Bull the closest to that, even though it exposes them in a few places? But
they probably are. I mean, because they used to do the opposite, didn't they? When they had the engine deficit, they would start to configure the car around the outlier low-speed circuits because they knew they could maybe steal 2, 3 or 4 race wins a year by doing that. But now they're in a position where they can win the championship if they design the car for the best spread of circuits rather than those specific ones.
I would certainly say if you're going to have a compromise and you're going to be exposed somewhere, then the right one is to be exposed at the Monacos and the Singapores. That's the correct approach to take. So yeah, I don't think they'll be too worried, but we could see something very different over the coming races. It could be more of a battle, and I think if on more conventional tracks they're struggling, that could make things very, very interesting. Well, thanks very much to everyone for your questions, and thanks to Scott and Ben for your answers. Remember to check out our Patreon page now if you'd like to sign up for the Race Members Club through that. As we've said, no obligation for existing members to do that. You can if you want, or you can carry on as before, but we've got lots of exciting things coming up for members. Well, we've got to turn our attentions now properly to the Spanish Grand Prix, so stay with us for everything you need to know from the world of Formula One.
The Athletic.